Sonic the Hedgehog's geopolitical situation is wild, and I think no section of gameplay qualifies this statement more than the city escape level from Sonic Adventure 2. Here we have a nation's military bringing in a SWAT car the size of an apartment complex, doing unfathomable amounts of property damage, and probably causing dozens of civilian casualties just because Sonic kind of looks like the hedgehog that they were looking for. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's get into it. Also, hi, my name is freaking Nick, and no, I don't think I'm overthinking this. In order to fully understand how we got to the point where the government is pancaking their own citizens to catch a hedgehog, we're gonna have to get some context, so let's set the stage. One of the major entities in the early 2000s Sonic games is a country known as the United Federation. They are a global superpower that is definitely not based on any countries we know of today. They have a president, a history with ethically questionable projects, and a fat military-industrial complex. The army serving the United Federation is known as the Guardian Units of Nations, often shortened to G.U.N, which is a little on the nose, but whatever. Not only do they act as the country's primary defense system, but they also act as an international peacekeeping force. They apparently have been granted a lot of leeway to act without oversight, given their ability to quickly mobilize on potential threats with questionable impunity, you might say. And while they do have a lot of manpower, the bulk of their peacekeeping and military force is made up of robots. So we've got a global superpower partnered with a large and technologically advanced global military, and they tend to prioritize security over ethics. What could possibly go wrong? 50 years before the events of Sonic Adventure 2, the United Federation worked with Dr. Gerald Robotnik, who they tasked with coming up with a solution for immortality. This later became known as Project Shadow. Robotnik saw through the guise of the UF's motivations and recognized that, rather than using the research for medical purposes, they wanted to create weapons of mass destruction. However, Robotnik went along with this research request because he believed he could use the funding and the resources to find a cure for his terminally ill granddaughter Maria. Also, he did all of this in space, which is pretty cool. Using the power of the Chaos Emeralds, otherwise known as gaming's favorite MacGuffin, the first step of Project Shadow resulted in the creation of Chaos Drives. These energy and computing sources were promptly flipped by the military to mass produce the aforementioned robots. The next step was to expand this research by creating the ultimate life form. One thing led to another. They accidentally created an unstable lizard, Gerald contacted an alien for help, and then Shadow the Hedgehog was created. Somehow, all this leaked to the United Federation, and they were a little concerned that their collaborator was working with aliens and creating weird rampaging lizards. Rather than negotiating this or cutting off his funding, they sent G.U.N to raid the Ark space colony and take Shadow by force. They destroyed all of the evidence, killed every researcher who knew anything about Project Shadow, and evacuated the civilians. Maria was killed in the crossfire, and the United Federation took custody of both Shadow and Gerald Robotnik. The cover-up story that the government fed the public was that there was a biohazard outbreak on the Ark. Those who died were casualties of this outbreak instead of, being murdered by the military, and Gerald Robotnik was the one to blame for all of this. This may be a radical opinion, but I feel like the United Federation overstepped a little bit here. But oh well, at least there won't be any lasting consequences, right? Gerald Robotnik had the same reaction that we all would have to being betrayed and watching his treasured granddaughter be murdered by his country. He went mad and plotted the destruction of all of humanity. He devised a plan to destroy the world by crashing the Ark into it, and he got Shadow on board by brainwashing him. The government didn't know what to do with these two, so they kept them in custody, and a few years later they decided that they would just execute Gerald. In the 50 years that followed, Ivo Robotnik had his rise to power. Much like his grandfather Gerald, Ivo had a genius intellect. However, rather than channeling that genius to the betterment of humanity like Gerald did, Ivo sought to conquer the world and became the world's greatest supervillain. This led to G.U.N escalating its forces and power to be able to at least try to keep up with Dr. Eggman's attempts to conquer the world. They installed bases all around the globe and kept cranking out robots and soldiers. And while it's not explicitly the United Federation or G.U.N's fault that Ivo turned out to be a supervillain, you have to wonder if Dr. Eggman would have turned out differently if his grandpa had been around. He clearly looked up to the guy and wanted to be like him, so it's not too much of a stretch to say that if Gerald had been around as a mentor figure and a role model, maybe Eggman would have turned out to be a better man. This sentiment is supported by both the games and the movies.
You ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had a family?
No.
Maybe you wouldn't have gone full supervillain.
So while you can make an argument that part of the reason why the United Federation is this heavily militarized, borderline authoritarian state is because there's a mad scientist to deal with, we have this situation where their involvement probably is what made this mad scientist to begin with. It just goes to show that sometimes a power-hungry nation can create their own worst enemies. We are 5 minutes and 37 seconds into this video, and I haven't even mentioned our fuzzy blue friend yet. We're first introduced to G.U.N in Sonic Adventure 2, where their influence is felt in every aspect of the narrative. Their robots are their primary enemies, they're constantly meddling in everything, and they have cute propaganda posters just lying around. Despite their strength, Sonic and his crew are basically the world's greatest counter-terrorist force in this universe, to the point where they were repeatedly foiling Eggman's attempts to take over the world. A few months before the events of Sonic Adventure 2, Sonic pretty famously saved the world from a monster known as Chaos. And I say famously because it's a significant plot point in Sonic Adventure 2 that the reason Tails has the Piss Rock Chaos Emerald is because the people they saved during Sonic Adventure gifted it to him as a token of their gratitude, and it's even in the newspaper. Sonic Adventure 2 starts with Dr. Eggman breaking through all of G.U.N's security systems to bust Shadow out of prison, once again proving how G.U.N is kind of useless when it comes to doing the one thing they're supposed to be doing. Ivo and Shadow decide that they'll gather the Chaos Emeralds and meet back up at the Ark. Robotnik thinks that they're doing this to subjugate the world under their power, but Shadow knows that they're doing it to destroy the world outright, as was planned by Gerald all those years ago. This is where the crazy stuff we talked about at the beginning of the video comes into play. G.U.N was hunting for Shadow after his escape, and instead they wound up taking Sonic into custody, which is really weird if you think about it for more than just a couple of seconds. Because as we mentioned, Sonic is pretty well known at this point. He recently saved the world. G.U.N, being the biggest military force on the planet, should know that the Blue Hedgehog is the one who saved the world a couple months ago, and is not the one that they are looking for. So this is either gross incompetence or yet another ethics disaster, as they knew that Sonic wasn't Shadow and went through with it so they could lie to the public and say,
"Ladies and gentlemen, we got him."
But let's revisit the methods that G.U.N used for all this. Bear in mind, City Escape takes place in Central City, which is the nation's capital of the United Federation. So we have G.U.N deploying killer robots and driving this big-ass truck down the residential areas in the nation's capital to chase the wrong guy who they probably know is the wrong guy. And it's pretty clear that there wasn't enough time to stage any meaningful evacuation, so as I said at the beginning, they are almost definitely dozens of casualties and millions of dollars worth of property damage. And I think we can all agree that putting thousands of innocent civilians in danger to catch just one suspected terrorist is a war crime. Right? After probably killing this soldier in a mech suit, Sonic ends up getting apprehended and taken to Prison Island, another high-security G.U.N facility. Tails and Amy, who are both children, they seem to know exactly where this top-secret prison is, and they manage to reach it with no problems and undetected. Tails because he heard it on satellite television.
I heard the news about it on satellite TV.
And Amy because who knows. Consequently, Eggman is also there undetected and also breaking into the exact same prison island. So they have 3 break-ins all at the same time. Tails and Eggman get into an entire altercation, also without being detected by the military, and this ends when Eggman leaves because he misses his wife or something. While Tails and Amy were there to get Sonic out of prison, Eggman was there with Rouge and Shadow to steal more Chaos Emeralds from the military, and they rigged the entire island to blow up. If you pay attention to the timestamps at the beginning of all of the cutscenes, we have 3 prison breaks, 2 false apprehensions, and 5 stolen Chaos Emeralds that all happen under G.U.N's nose in the space of about 36 hours. This would probably be the biggest military scandal in history for these guys. Also, another thing that goes like completely unaddressed is Sonic escapes the military base on a missile that G.U.N fired. We don't know who the intended target was for this missile. Now that he's got most of the Chaos Emeralds, Eggman is able to activate the Ark's cannon and threatens the world by pissing on the moon with this giant laser. Around this same time, Tails goes on a cop killing spree. That's not relevant to anything that we're talking about, I just think it's funny because he's literally like 5 years old. Sonic and Tails decide that the next logical recourse of action is to board the President of the United Federation's limo, uninvited, while he's on there, to track where Eggman is broadcasting from. I don't know. The Secret Service must suck too, I guess. They trace the broadcast back to the space colony Ark, and they take off with the president's copy of The Sims 4. The group then, wait, how did they get to Egypt? They find out that somehow Eggman was able to turn one of the pyramids of Giza into a secret base without anyone knowing. I don't know what the heck is going on with this world. Knuckles fights the king of the ghosts, because of course he does, and they all make it to space. The whole point of this video is to highlight how useless the United Federation's government and G.U.N are at containing any disasters and how much they abuse their powers, and the rest of this game doesn't really involve them, so for the sake of closure, I'm going to summarize what happens. Ivo Robotnik tries to subjugate Earth, but Gerald's plan is revealed and the Ark is set on a crash course to Earth to make humanity suffer. Everybody teams up to try to stop this from happening, and Shadow beats up the unstable lizard that we touched on about 8 minutes and 19 seconds ago. But then, plot twist, the lizard shoves a giant cannon up its ass, which makes it more powerful, and so Sonic and Shadow use the Chaos Emeralds to go Super Saiyan, and they kill the lizard, save the world, and everybody's happy, except they all think Shadow died in the process. This whole scenario seemed to be a bit of a wake-up call for the United Federation, because in future games, they don't actively try to impede Sonic and his friends unless there are time travel shenanigans involved and it's like an alternate universe version of G.U.N. However, the same cannot be said for Hot Topic, because in Shadow the Hedgehog, G.U.N is all up in his business for the entire duration of the game. Even though it is very well known at this point that Sonic and Shadow are the good guys because the president has a picture of them framed on his desk, the commander of G.U.N just holds a grudge and decides that that's more important than national security. But at the end of the game, when Shadow the Hedgehog saves the world yet again, is finally when the United Federation and G.U.N decide to truly chill out, and the commander apologizes for letting his feelings get in the way of the facts. And after this, G.U.N decides to just completely dedicate themselves to what they're best at, trying to fight off Eggman and failing spectacularly every damn time. But credit where it's due, after several years and several Avengers level threats, the United Federation and G.U.N learned that they don't have to be the only people who try to fight off these scenarios. There could be others who do it too. But let's touch on some counterpoints that I know that some of you are going to have. For the rest of this video, I'm going to play devil's advocate because heaven knows that a fictional, borderline authoritarian government needs people on their side. We have established that all of this was set in motion because the UF tried to trick a scientist into creating weapons of mass destruction. Objectively, that is an awful thing to do. But, for starters, we don't know if they had any enemies at this time, and also, I can kind of see why they would want to find out the potential of the Chaos Emeralds and why they would want to protect them from other entities. Like these 7 little gems whose power can be summed up by the words random bullshit go is not a good thing to fall in the wrong hands. However, their cause was clearly not noble and they did not want to just keep the Chaos Emeralds out of the wrong hands, they wanted to be the wrong hands. We also have established that Eggman tries to take over the world once every year or so through huge acts of terrorism, which admittedly is a good reason for this world to have a large military presence. I do think, though, like I said earlier, that none of this would have happened if they hadn't screwed over Gerald Robotnik. I personally believe Ivo Robotnik is a creation of the United Federation. It's like their own sins coming back to haunt them. Also, for the Sonic and Shadow mix-up, I have a really hard time buying that they mixed them up. It had to be intentional. But I do think that the reason they were so reckless with this was once again because they were terrified of the Chaos Emeralds going to someone who was not them. But just like pretty much everything we've talked about, the United Federation and G.U.N tend to make their own problems a lot worse because they are just terrible at trying to manage everything themselves. They kept several Chaos Emeralds in the same base, which made it easy for Eggman, Rouge, and Shadow to pull off a heist and take several at once. So in conclusion, I think the biggest issue with the geopolitical situation in Sonic the Hedgehog's world is that it is all one country trying to consolidate all of the power for themselves. They tried to create weapons of mass destruction and it backfired and probably created the world's biggest terrorist in Dr. Eggman. They tried to hoard all the Chaos Emeralds and it makes it quick work for someone to steal them all. I honestly feel like most of the events of the Sonic franchise would have been avoided if the United Federation didn't have their heads up their own asses and they established some allies. Having the Chaos Emeralds spread across the country with a few good allies would make it a lot harder for a villain to have all 7 of them by the end of day 3. And I know at this point there are probably already several comments that are saying things like, bro's doing serious analysis over a children's game. But honestly, the fact that the United Federation and G.U.N took a step back from interfering with the good guys and even started working with them in the later games shows that this was probably the interpretation that Sega had all along. It seems pretty clear to me that they are critiquing the idea that one country has the power and the ability to handle everything by themselves, and trying to do so could lead to disastrous consequences for the rest of the world. But hey, at least we don't have any countries like that in our world, right?